Good morning and welcome to the foundation session of the pre-conference of the Innovation and Knowledge, or Knowledge and Innovation Interest Group. I mean, I said it both ways to make sure we're not offending either side of the divide. Let me just, I just want to say a few words about what's the idea behind this session. Then I hand over to Corey to introduce Linda and then to the panel, which is what you're all for here, and to Linda, of course. 4 years ago in the business meeting, we asked, what is it that you'd like from the interest group? And many of you said, we would like to get closer to the people behind the ideas that so much have changed and inspired our work. So we thought, okay, how could we do that? And one thought was to do a session with the thinkers, but in a way that it would make it, two goals. One of them is to make it accessible. So what you're about to see is the culmination of a long process of almost a year, mapping, reading all of Linda's work. And so you're having the handouts, you have the maps in front of you. And the second thing is where we are interested in the ideas, we know the ideas, we're interested in the person behind the ideas. So we're really interested in getting to know Linda and getting closer to Linda as much as we could do that. And that is the goal of this session. So it's the third time we do it, and actually we're very, very, very proud and happy to have Linda, and I would let Corey, which is the chair, would explain that.
Thank you, Gabriel. So, good morning, everyone. I just want to pick up where Gabriel left off. He gave you a little bit of an idea of the rationale and the history behind these sessions, and it's my responsibility now to introduce this year's Foundation's thought leader. And I want to start with, I'm not going to do the typical CV introduction. Florian and Sunkee are going to go into tremendous depth about Linda's CV, in terms of where she went to school, what her degrees are, all of the papers published. I'm just going to tell you two stories, because I love to tell stories. That's the great thing about this business, is we get to tell stories. So the year is 2000. I am finishing up my PhD at NYU. My dissertation committee, two people in particular, Teresa Lant, Raghu Garud, both people that work in organizational learning and the intersection with innovation, told me, well, if you're doing work at the intersection of organizational learning and innovation, you have to read Linda's book, Organizational Learning, so published in 1999, the first edition. I believe the second edition was just very recently published, the updated version of this book. So I had read the book cover to cover, and Linda had actually come to NYU to give a talk and was gracious enough to sit down with a doctoral student who thought he knew something about the intersection of organizational learning and innovation, and spend 30, 45 minutes with me talking about these ideas. So the reason I'm telling you this story is, as Gabriel said, one of the reasons that we're doing these sessions is to make a closer personal link between the researcher and the ideas. I think everybody in this room has probably read at least one, if not multiple, Linda Argote papers. You may not have had the opportunity to actually have met her, talk to her, experience her in any way. So this is an opportunity to do so. So, and that's why I'm telling you this story, is that this is symptomatic of who Linda is. She spends the time with people, doctoral students, to work with them, regardless if they're from her institution or not. A former doctoral student of mine who's been at Tepper for a few years now, Param Singh, is now a colleague and co-author of Linda's. He works in IS, which again gives you a sense of the scope of Linda's interest, not just within organization theory, but learning more broadly defined. The more recent story that I had the great opportunity to have Linda as a discussant on a paper of mine, Melissa Schilling and I had a paper published in Management Science a few years ago that received an Informs Award last year. And Linda was the discussant at the Informs Conference in Phoenix, Arizona. And it was a fantastic opportunity for Melissa and I to sit down and hear her perspective, a much longer, deeper, wider perspective on the topic of organizational learning than what Melissa and I have had the opportunity to pursue. So again, it gives you a sense of the scope of her work, but more importantly, I think it gives you a sense of the fact that this is not only a scholar, this is a scholar who believes in helping other scholars, regardless of where those people happen to be, at her institution, at others, at various stages of careers. Now, I'll just give you a very brief introduction into the format. So the format originated with Gabriel for the first foundation session 2 years ago with Sid Winter. We have two doctoral students. We have, on my left, we have Florian Rittiner from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and we have Sunkee from INSEAD. What they have done, as Gabriel said, is a tremendous amount of work into preparing for this session. Some of the work is in the handout. But what they're going to do is they're going to lead Linda through a discussion of her work, past, present, and future. And then at some point, as we get maybe 2/3 of the way through the session, we'll have an opportunity to open up to Q&A from everybody. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone and the floor over to Florian and Sunkee. But before I do, please join me in welcoming the third year recipient of the Foundation Thought Leader for the Knowledge Innovation Interest Group, Miss Linda Argote. Step out of the way now.
Just say what an honor it is to be here, to see friends and colleagues whose work I admire in the audience, and to have a chance to work with Florian and Sunkee, who are amazing PhD students. It speaks very well for the future of the field to have people the caliber of you in it. So.
Thank you. Well, thank you. So I'll open up the session. So I'm Sunkee Lee from INSEAD. I'm a second-year PhD student in strategy, and I will be facilitating with Florian this session with Linda. So I think it will be pretty safe to say that everyone probably most likely are here because they saw in the program book the name Linda Argote. And another thing that might be safe to say would be that everyone here probably has some or more or less interest in organizational learning.
However, I wonder how many of you actually know how many articles or books that Linda has published throughout her whole career. And also, what kind of prior literature that her work is building on.
So when we got this opportunity to interview Linda, we had the same questions in mind. And in order to find out the answer of these two questions, we created something called the literature map. So what this literature map does is on the upper hand, it has the works of Linda, and on the bottom hand, it has the works of the foundation of Linda's work. So in total, we found around 60 works published by Linda. And due to limit of space, we included only 32 of them, which were the most influential ones. And the blue circles are the key themes. There are 6 of them, key themes that we analyzed and we categorized into. And the green boxes shows whether they were empirical, conceptual, or review papers. And the red boxes show which literature in the map that this certain paper is citing. And then finally, in the box in the right-hand corner, there is the number of citations a certain paper has received. So you could see the impact of such paper. So having this map in mind, we would like to this is a very long story short, this map, and so you want to hear more about the details directly from Linda. So that would be the main purpose of this session. So why don't we first start off by asking Linda about her early careers. You have become a very prominent business school scholar, a business management scholar. However, I wonder if it was planned from the beginning and how it sort of evolved.
Well, as we discussed, I started out college, and I'll date myself. I started Tulane, which was in my home institute, my home city, in '71, thinking I would be a math teacher, and then took a psychology course, which just seemed fascinating because it had the rigor of math, but very interesting questions. So I got more and more interested in psych. and then had an opportunity to go abroad to apply. This is strange. I don't want to leave you guys out, but I also want to, so I'll maybe talk like this, to an opportunity to go abroad. I was able to use a scholarship to go to the University of Nottingham, England in 1973-74. And that was an era, those of you that were around then can remember a lot of change in women's roles and women's opportunities. And I came back thinking, well, maybe I could do something different than be a math teacher, and did an honors thesis and then went off to Michigan for graduate work. Had gotten aware, in part through the teaching I'd done, some schools that they were doing the same work, but very different outcomes, and it seemed to me that there were these organizational factors that would be so fascinating to try to understand. So went off to Michigan not knowing much about what a PhD was. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, so a PhD was not something I knew a whole lot about, and maybe that was good, but went to Michigan and worked on a project that Basil Georgopoulos had on the effectiveness of hospital emergency units. It was a comparative study of the effectiveness of hospitals, so that was a great opportunity. Also got to work with Dan Katz, at least have him as a mentor. If you remember Katz and Kahn, the social psychology of organizations, and was a wonderful person as well as being a great scientist.
Right. So thank you, Linda. And if you see on the map, you can find that in her early work, as she mentioned, it started off with structural contingency of organizations, and then it sort of evolves into something called robotics, and then it sort of evolves into the learning part, which she's most famous for. So we were wondering how this sort of change sort of happened throughout your research.
So when I went to Carnegie Mellon in 1979, they had just launched a robotics institute. And my original interest, I thought I would combine the structural contingency, that this would be a new task characteristics, technology characteristics engendered by the robots. So I originally saw it as an extension of the structural contingency theory. Paul Goodman and I did a couple of case studies, and then the more I got into that area, I realized, and this was early 80s, that there really weren't that many robots being used yet. So, to be able to study them, it was going to take many years, and certainly not the sort of length of time that one, has for a career, or at least for getting tenure. So while that was, I think, disappointing in terms of the initial goal, it was very useful in terms of, it was actually that work that took me into plants, and these were mainly manufacturing plants, automotive and aerospace, and I discovered this phenomenon of the learning curve, which as a psychologist, I'd seen learning curves at the individual level, but I had not yet been exposed to organizational learning curves. And there seemed some very interesting phenomena there. On the one hand, there was one plant that had fired a manager because he wasn't moving down the learning curve fast enough. There was the normative belief that he should be achieving an 80% learning curve, and he hadn't achieved that, so he was separated, was I believe the term that was used. But there seemed, when I started looking at the literature, there was really a lot of variation in learning rates that people didn't understand very well. So that seemed an interesting puzzle to pursue. Also, the whole issue of forgetting, or whether the knowledge in the learning curve was cumulative. I was at an aerospace firm, and the head of industrial engineer came to me as the academic who should know all these things. They had wound down orders of a particular subassembly. They were producing other things, but this one subassembly they'd wound down orders of, and they were making a bid. So they wanted to know how to predict their cost, and all the material he had was that, well, you would just follow the learning curve. But this seemed curious to him. There'd been this break in production. He thought the cost would go up again. So I started looking at the literature, and while there were some papers that had talked about forgetting might occur, empirically all the work assumed that knowledge was cumulative and persisted through time. So that seemed an interesting puzzle as well. So the work in the for the robotics really exposed me to this, or the work in the plants exposed me to this phenomena that I found fascinating, and then started to work on that.
So we saw from your CV that in the mid 80s that you go to Stanford,
Right.
And wondered if that sort of experience had any influence on your work.
That was a big influence. It was an opportunity where I got to know Jim March, who was very generous and invited me to sit in on his course on organizational learning. In fact, that's where I first met Teresa Lant and Steve Mazias, which was a great opportunity. The department I was in, the Department of Industrial Engineering and Engineering Management, Bob Sutton had been a colleague of mine in graduate school, and he had facilitated that connection for me. But there I met other people like Kathleen Eisenhardt and Paul Adler and Jim Jucker, who were interested in organizations and learning. So it was a great environment to be in for that to take off. And I should also mention personally, when I had gone to Carnegie Mellon, I met Dennis Epple, who was down the hall from me. This was the old days where our phones were these big black things. You guys remember these big black things with multiple lines? You guys don't remember this. Maybe I hope somebody remembers. They used to be big black things, and they would have multiple lines on them. So in your office, multiple lines would ring. So my phone rang in Dennis's office, and his rang in mine. And our norms especially on weekends or nights, if you were there and somebody else's phone was ringing, you would take the message. So after about a year of taking messages for each other, we did start to date and then get married. So proximity does matter. And then we driving together through, and I guess this is another lesson about proximity. Driving cross country to California, we had a lot more time to talk for extended periods, and discovered we were both interested in this area of organizational learning, coming at it from somewhat different perspectives. But that's when we started the work, which, as you know, it can take a while for papers to come out. So the work didn't start hitting publications until 1990, but that's when we began it. And I should mention the first study we did got turned down from the first journal we submitted it to. So that also adds some time in the process.
So your works on learning curves start in the early 1990s, but we found that you frequently mention this assembly plant of trucks. And so I wonder, so given that it's so mentioned so frequently, I wonder what kind of plant that was and what sort of your experience was there, and what you learned from there and how it influenced your subsequent work.
Great. So this was when we came back to Carnegie Mellon. We had an opportunity to get involved with a project at 3 truck assembly plants. And the angle we were interested in, not surprisingly, was learning. What was valuable about the plants, I think 3 things. One was the data they provided. That was probably the most valuable. Secondly was just being there, getting to talk to the managers. I think that's what crystallized the questions we later worked on. Indeed, when we interviewed managers, and we did this just by way of background to try to be sure we were including all the things that were important to learning curves. So we did some very open-ended interviews about, well, what explains these learning curves? Because they were certainly very aware of them in their context. And a lot of what they said was what had been discussed in the literature, maybe not studied empirically, but at least had been discussed. But they did say something that had not been mentioned before, and that was knowing who's good at what and assigning tasks accordingly. Now, they didn't use the word transactive memory, but around the same time, Daniel Wegner was publishing his work on transactive memory, which was a similar concept, but at the dyad level, applying to people in close relationships, where they might specialize, and one person be the expert on where to get things fixed, and the other person be the expert on birthdays on both sides of the family. we thought so we learned about that concept through social psychologists, and then that sounded very much like the concept that we'd heard about at these truck assembly plants. So that's when Dick Moreland and I started working on, with Diane Liang, this idea of transactive memory, originally trying to at least extend it up to the group level, the idea being that groups who had better transactive memories, who knew who was good at what, could assign tasks to the best qualified person, and then they also knew who to go to if something unexpected comes up. So if I know what Florian's an expert in, I know to consult him when I have an issue arise in that area, or what Sunkee's an expert in. So we thought that concept had some legs to think about in groups and organizations as well.
So we can say that from then on, your sort of research evolved around three major topics, which was learning curves, knowledge transfer, and transactive memory. So why don't we start off by talking a bit more about the learning curve studies, which were a very early part of your works. And so could you tell us more, so what was the current sort of state of the learning curve research at the time you started it, and what sort of pieces that you saw was missing from the literature? You can give some examples from your research of the findings that you have found about learning curves.
Okay, so one issue that we saw was this idea of variation in learning rates. So these three truck plants we studied, they were all producing the same product, they were all part of the same organization, but had very different rates of learning. So that suggested to us it was what was going on at the plant, if you will, because the macro factors were constant and the technological factors were constant. The product factors were constant. There were some differences in technology, but the best performing plant with the lowest unit cost and the worst performing with the highest used the same technology, and it was the middle one that used a different technology. So that didn't seem to explain it. So understanding that variation, and other people were writing about this at similar times. Hayes and Clark had a piece, theirs actually came out earlier than ours. Subsequently, Amy Edmondson and Boehmer and Pisano have published in healthcare, and other people, this variation in learning rates. The other thing that was very interesting to us was that these three plants were all part of the same organization. One of them had really very poor learning rates, an 83% learning curve, to use the lingo of progress ratios, that every time the cumulative output doubled, cost declined to 83% of their previous value, which was much higher. They were, again, hoping for the 80%. So this was causing all sorts of problems. The dealers weren't happy because they weren't able to get the trucks to them in time. The material people weren't happy because all this material was piling up because they weren't making it fast enough. But for us, the puzzle was, well, why couldn't they learn from these sister plants that were doing, the same tasks? Why couldn't that plant learn from the others? So I think it was a great example of the concept of stickiness that Gabriel has talked about so eloquently, and the fact that knowledge doesn't flow seamlessly. There are barriers. So that led us to want to do work on trying to understand knowledge transfer. And then issues of forgetting, trying to understand forgetting.
So, that, I guess that naturally leads to your second topic, which is knowledge transfer. And I guess the most famous, I would say famous piece was the pizza. The
pizza paper, right? That's right. How it's. So I'll be known for life for the pizza paper.
So can you maybe talk about that paper with us?
So that work is joint with Eric Dahr, who now I'm proud to say is president of a new university in Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. Eric was a student in my course at the time on organization theory, and I had mentioned how we had been doing the work, this was the early 90s, that we'd been doing these work in the truck assembly plants, but there were only three producing the same product. So our N was very small to do anything at the organizational level of analysis. and that we really wanted a site where there were lots of people who were standardized, fairly standardized organizations where we could meaningfully compare their productivity and where there would be interesting variation. And Eric had the brilliant idea of pizza franchises that he referred to them as the fruit fly of organizational research. I don't think we want to push that metaphor too far, but so we were, with his leadership, got data from 36 of these pizza stores centered around an area in southwestern Pennsylvania. Now, some of these stores were mom and pop, where one owner just had one store, and then the maximum in our sample was 11. One owner had 11 stores. So we looked at whether there was learning. We did find learning, and we did find transfer within the same franchisee, but not across the different ones. And then we were able to get some qualitative data, some interviews about, we interviewed them about what innovations they'd introduced and why and where they'd learned from them. And so we learned more about making pizza than we'd ever planned to when we started the work. But it was interesting to see what these innovations were that were being transferred across the stores.
So you mentioned this qualitative sort of data that you got, and I wonder, so what kind of things they mentioned as mechanisms for knowledge transfer?
Mm-hmm. So the things they mainly mentioned were observing another store, and again that was more likely to happen among common ownership, and communicating with another store. I think personnel movement's also incredibly important. They didn't mention that, but we saw that again within the franchisee, not between the franchisees. So when we did the work, we looked at, when we tried to catalog the different innovations they'd mentioned. I haven't read that paper in a while. It was, I think, about 14. But we cataloged whether they were embedded in routines, which a lot of them were, and so one example was the placing pepperoni on pizza. So this is a problem in the industry. They had introduced a deep dish pizza over the course of the study, which, as you know, has a thicker crust. So the usual way they placed pepperoni on pizza was to distribute it more or less evenly on the pizza. Well, if you did that on the deep dish, when it cooked, because the crust was thicker, it all went in the middle in an unappealing clump. So they tried several ways of dealing with that. One store had assigned a person to be stationed at the oven to periodically intervene and move the pepperoni around, which, as you can imagine, for a lot of reasons, that was not very satisfying. But then one of the stores discovered, and as far as we could tell, this was trial and error, not through mathematical programming, but if you put the pepperoni like spokes on a wheel before the pie was cooked, as it cooked and the cheese flowed, they would come out more or less evenly distributed. So that was an example of one of the routines that did transfer, and we think what helped it was that it was embedded in a routine that facilitate the transfer. There were some others that were embedded mainly in the people, like how to hand toss pizza, and that you would need the personnel movement to have those move, and then some embedded in the technology. So one store had developed a shredder for distributing cheese evenly, so things like that.
So would the pizza be like a manufacturing firm?
So it has elements of both, which I think we want to, and maybe I don't study this literature, and maybe it has moved in this direction, but specifying more what the underlying variable was, as opposed to just manufacturing versus service, as we discussed. So in some ways it was like service. This was all on demand. So, if kids at Carnegie Mellon are staying up late studying for exams, and they get a big upswing in the number of people wanting a pizza right then, they've got to deal with it. So it's not like the truck assembly also, where they very carefully space. So they put the trucks that require more work, like a extended cab, they would never put them back to back. They would distribute them out in the workflows so that you would have time to recover from one of the challenging before you did the others. But you can't do that in the pizza because it's on demand. You've got to keep the customers happy. So on that factor, I think it is more like service. On others, as you implied, it's perhaps more like manufacturing, and that there's still a physical production flow that they're going through.
So I guess your later on works, quite recent works, sort of look into the service part of knowledge transfer. And can you share the findings that you found in the service firms?
So I'm going to ask Gabriel to help out on that. I think he's more expert than I am on that. One of the things that we've tried to look at is, and this is actually in a laboratory study, is the role of identity, which we think is very important. That if you share an identity with someone, you're more likely to give them a chance to try to learn from them. Whereas if you don't share an identity, you're more likely to reject it, and that's not the way we do things here. So we're not saying blind adoption, that if you share an identity with someone, you'll do whatever they say, but more that you will give them a chance to show what they know and see if you can learn with them. So I think the whole issue of identity is fascinating. We went in the lab because in the field it seemed confounded with so many other things that it was hard to pinpoint that the effect was on identity. But if people are smarter than I am and can figure out how to do it in the field, that would be terrific. Or more lab work is also welcome, I think.
So why don't we talk more about transactive memory then?
Yeah, you already told us a little bit about how you got to study the transactive memory system and the story about the managers, about who knows what, and the importance of that. Can you tell us a bit more about the elements of transactive memory systems? So what is that actually?
So when we were, and again, we went into the lab for the first study we did, Dick Moreland, Diane Liang, and I. Dick's a colleague in psychology. Diane was a graduate student of ours at the time, who's now a very successful novelist. So she, I think, is having a much larger, more people are reading her work of this form than our work. But if you like mysteries, Diane Wei Liang has two very nice ones. So we wanted to see, well, what were indicators of transactive memory? How would you know, if you will? So one was this specialization where different people were doing different things, sort of a memory differentiation. You knew what you relied on Florian for, and then you didn't have to learn it because you knew you could ask Florian, and vice versa. The other was you trusted each other's expertise. So if Sunkee said, oh, I know how to do that, you respected that instead of saying, oh, the last time he said that, that didn't get us very far. And coordination, that because you knew who was good at what, you knew who to go to, so there was coordination built in. So we originally coded this from videotapes, but Kyle Lewis then developed a measure and published it in JAP in 2003, where she took those indicators and developed measures of it, which questionnaire measures, which have the advantage of they take less time than videotypes, and you can also use them for a variety of groups right now. One of the appealing things about the concept to me was, besides it reverberated with me, I thought, oh yeah, I've seen that, and some organizations really do seem to have well-developed transactive memories where people know who to consult and you've got the right person in the right job, whereas others, maybe they have the most aggressive person in the better jobs who might not be the best at it, and they don't really seem to know who to rely on. And certainly when I teach this concept, both the MBAs and the executives I teach seem to reverberate to it. It's one that they seem to identify with. At a more research level, I think it's a very nice concept that it has one of the properties of linking from the individual to the group, or sort of a micro-macro link that we talk about as needing more in our field. And I think this has the potential to provide that.
When we've been preparing for this interview, we also asked the Knowledge and Innovation Interest Group to send us their questions. And a couple of these questions were actually related to social networks, online communities, or let's say technological advancements in general. And knowing who knows what sounds a lot as social networks. So how do you think might these influence transactive memory systems?
Yeah, I think looking more at the link on that would be fascinating. So Ching Ren and I did a review of the literature on transactive memory that came out in the 2011 Annals of the Academy of Management. And that was one of the things we concluded, that more, because there's been a little work on social capital and transactive memory, but not work specifically on social networks and transactive memory. And I think that's a very rich area that would benefit from work. You know, my hypothesis suggests might be that they would complement each other. I would think that certain social networks, dense networks, for example, might be more likely to, because of the richer communication, develop stronger transactive memory systems. But that would be very interesting to look at. So I would bet that they're more likely to be complementary than substitutes, but that would be very, very interesting to look at.
Well, transactive memory in particular is on the group. So you had the group as a unit of analysis, and actually in your recent book you refer to group processes as being the micro foundations of organizational learning. So can you tell us a bit more about the group, and why is it such a nice unit of analysis to study organizational learning?
So I find it nice from both a applied point of view. I think many organizations are made of groups, so if you can study how the groups learn and then the learning across groups, I think that tells you a lot about organizational learning. Also, as a research sort of microcosm, groups have many of the same processes that go on as organizations. You know, they have coordination, communication, influence. But it's easier to see learning in them, say in small groups, than it is, you know, in this large 2,000 plus manufacturing facility. You can map the learning curve. It's really hard to go in and study at a micro level, you know, which of those 2,000 people is learning what and how they're learning it. Whereas in the groups, I think you can really see that. So I find them as a nice sort of microcosm of many of the elements, not all. I mean, organizations are usually larger. Power dynamics can have a lot more meaning, the power in politics. I mean, you see those in groups, but they can take on more impact or import in organizations. And then there's knowledge transfer across groups. So they're certainly not the whole picture, but I think they help us, you know, get a handle on some of what in a way that studying the organizational level can be hard to.
So when we look at the implications then of this research, so you touched upon a couple of things. So what would be the main challenge, or what experience do you as being the main challenge then on really bring these group level findings to the next level, to the level of the organization?
So I think one is that looking at temporal aspects, that in organizations, on the one hand, I mean, you can study temporal effects, and maybe we need to differentiate whether we're talking about laboratory versus field, because as I think about what I was going to say was really more of a lab field difference and not so much a group organizational advantage. Michael Cohen, for example, I'm always reminded of his wonderful piece on routines in organization science in '94, where he argued that the groups, you know, are microcosms of organizations, and by studying at a very micro level how routines evolved, I think he provided, Cohen and Bekdayan provided really significant inputs. Now, as we go to generalize that, you know, there are issues of scale. When you've got many more people, how does that play out? When you've got longer time horizons, how does it play out? When you've got groups interacting with other groups and sort of ecologies, how does that play out? But I think can be a good starting point before then we add the more complexity in terms of what goes on in organizations.
Given the conference we are at, we'd also like to talk a little bit more about the linkages between organizational learning and strategy. And when Sunkee and I had been mapping out your work, we also noted a slight shift towards the strategy field in both the research that you are relating to, but also the publications that are citing your work. And that shift seemed to coincide with the rather influential paper that you wrote together with Paul Ingram that has been published in 2000. So we wonder, can you tell us a bit more about how you got in touch with the strategy community?
Right. So I think I was fortunate to have Dan Leventhal at Carnegie Mellon. So we talked a bit, but it wasn't until, as you pointed out, Paul Ingram arrived in '94, and that was also around the time that Sid Winter invited me to a conference in Vienna. That was the first time I met Gabriel. I remember having a very nice bus ride. I don't remember where we were going in the bus, but I remember a very nice conversation with you about knowledge transfer in that conference. And David Teese was there, Rebecca Henderson, so it was a great conference to get to know more of the strategy researchers and start to realize that, that there was sort of mutual, that I could learn a lot from them, and they were kind enough to say that what we were doing they thought had implications for them. So that started a new path, and the more I read, people like Connie Helfat's work on your piece on the products, I think always think that's a great example of knowledge transfer. And other people, Marvin Lieberman had been working on learning, and just a lot of really interesting work in the field of strategy that I've certainly enjoyed reading and trying to connect to.
Excellent. Well, especially for us as young scholars, it's always interesting to learn about what will be the future of a field. So we're just bluntly asked. So where do you see the organizational learning field evolve for the near future?
Well, I'll say a few things, and then maybe we can open it to this audience here who have contributed so much to it. So in my own work, I find myself both trying to get a bit more micro, trying to understand, say, what leads to the adoption of routines or exploration, exploitation at a fairly micro level. Working on a project with Param Singh that Corey alluded to and Alina Wang, where we're looking at an online forum that was introduced at a company where the CEO was one of our graduates. And it was a whole knowledge management system. They originally started out with repositories, and then that wasn't all that fruitful. So they've, in their view, and they've changed more to forums and blogs. And they were interested in, us assessing, is this working? Are people really spanning the globe in the way they hoped that these forums and blogs would lead to? So we were able to look at, they gave us over a year of data from the start of the forum, and we're trying to understand who answered the questions. So I think that whole issue of technology and what role does it play in learning, my sense of the knowledge management system seemed to be shifting from the capture model, the building the repositories, to more of the connect model, to try to have opportunities where people can ask questions or respond that way, and then maybe can follow up with the person offline. But I think that's a very rich area for us to learn more about. Also the social networks area. That's how networks affect learning. And knowledge transfer. There's been a fair amount on how networks affect transfer, maybe less on how they affect learning and how they affect memory, which would also be an area I'd like to see more work on.
Well, we also got two questions from the audience that have been related to the very micro level. So there's a recent trend in studies on cognitive neuroscience. So people start using eye tracking devices, brain imaging, and so on. So the very micro level. How do you see this line of research influencing organizational learning or learning in groups?
So I think it has the potential to say something about the mechanisms behind the learning. So for example, I got involved in a project with a group at Denmark, Borgo Bell, Dorda Hakkason, and they pulled me in because they were, well, long story short, on the one hand, I found out that the technology wasn't there to do what I wanted. I was hoping we could understand the difference between mindful and less mindful processing. There's a fair amount of evidence in individual psychology. They know where that's happening at the individual level. It's a frontal cortex sort of area. And I thought, well, that we invoke this concept of mindful and well, we don't want to say mindless. Nobody can get behind mindless, but less mindful learning a lot. And it would be fascinating if we could validate that and get at the underlying mechanism. But the technology isn't there. And I think this is still true, but people in the audience may be more up to date than I am. You can study one person. There have been a few attempts to link two people, but studying groups, studying organizations. I understand somebody's working on developing fMRI that are more like caps that you can just put on instead of having to go into these machines. So maybe that will be on the horizon. But my point is, I think it's certainly not going to replace the kind of field work we're doing. I think the combination, it may help us say something about the underlying mechanisms, or may help us validate, measures. If we can get pencil and paper measures and then validate it with a brain scan measure, maybe that will give us greater faith in the findings. But I don't think it's going to substitute for field work. And because a lot of what we do is about larger aggregates than individuals, and that's often where the exciting action is, I want us to keep our focus on that and not forget the fact that we're, organizations are multiple people. They're not just one.
So maybe before we opening up the session, I mean, you just pointed out to that. So it would be interesting. What are your current projects? Okay. So what are you working on? Could you share a bit of that?
So the project that with the Denmark group, I think morphed into a way that we're excited about still. We weren't able to do the brain scans, but we looked at the effect of emotion. So we were contrasting sort of the effect of emotion on decisions to explore versus exploit. These were decisions made by three-person teams, versus the Sired and March, performance worse than aspirations idea that you would change if your performance was lower than, in your immediate period was lower than the previous, so you didn't meet your aspirations. And we also had psychophysiological measures in that, so of emotion, and we're able to show actually both factors seem to affect in somewhat interesting. We think it's interesting. We'll see if the journals do. So that would be the sort of micro work. But then I'm also doing this work with Param, which is more macro, if you will, or at least looking at the role of technology in large organizations on who's responding to these questions. Have an art in the fire that hasn't taken off yet to do some work in hospitals, but I'm also hoping to be looking at learning in hospitals, which I find a very interesting context.
Thank you so much for sharing
Thank
this.
You. It's been a treat to get to know you all and to talk with you about these ideas.
So why don't we open up the stage for a couple of more questions from our audience, and
so just one word for Linda. The audience is not mic'd, so we want to capture the question.
Okay.
If you could, when you get it, just really quickly restate it and then answer it so we can capture it for posterity. So Questions for Linda? Can everybody raise their hand? Yes, back there. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Amrita. I'm a doctoral student at University of Washington. So my question was, I've been reading the literature on learning, and there's also discussion on group learning in groups through heuristics, like the development of group heuristics. So could you just help me understand a little bit how do you differentiate the learning through heuristics in terms of groups, group heuristics and transactive memory? And yeah.
So the question was how to differentiate learning of group heuristics versus transactive memory. It's a great question. My take on it is that heuristics are more shared understanding. So you develop a heuristic, this is how we're going to handle this situation, whereas a transactive memory is a more differentiated. There is an element of sharing because you know who's good at what, but it's more differentiated. So Florian would be the expert on X and would take care of remembering X and would do X, and Sunkee would be the expert on Y and Corey on Z, etc. So I think it's a difference between the transactive memories are differentiated knowledge structures, whereas the heuristics tend to be shared knowledge structures. But I think they are related and certainly are both, if you want to think of them as knowledge repositories, as you learn, you develop the heuristics and you also can develop a transactive memory.
Okay. So this is, I'm just curious in your opinion about something you're considered for you. So you talked about the importance of understanding groups and routines. You also do work at the very micro level on individuals. I'm wondering the extent to which you think we can study routines and group processes without going down to the individual level.
Interesting. Wow, that's a good question, hard question. So I don't know that we have to go to the individual level, but I think we have to go to, well, I don't know if we have to, but going to the level of small interacting, whether it's 3, I wouldn't want to go to 2, but maybe 3 might be the minimal that I would look at to see the sort of interactions and the interdependencies. I find it useful because I think you can see things dealing with these smaller groups, and sometimes you can, and again, I'm maybe confusing lab versus level of analysis, but in the lab you can determine causality in a way in the field that it's hard to do. But I wouldn't want to just stay in the lab because, you know, these things you study in the lab either could get swamped in the field or may not be very important in the field. So I'd want to see it in the field that there's something there and it's important and consequential, and then maybe go in the lab to try to dissect it a bit and learn more about it. So I don't think we have to go all the way to the individual. That would be my take.
Is that the answer that you wanted to go?
Well, it's an answer I agree with. That's what I agree with.
Other questions? All right, since you guys are shy, I'm going to ask my own question since I'm up here. So it's essentially definitional, but someone that's worked as long as you have in the organizational learning space and the learning spaces, you made this distinction earlier between learning and knowledge transfer. So I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that distinction, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question about the connection between learning and innovation because it's completely self-serving for me. So
okay, that's a harder.
And transfer first.
Okay, so the way I would do it is to look at what the level of the transfer is. So if the transfer is between people or between groups or between organizations, I would want to look at how the experience of those units, you know, affects each other. Where I think it gets very close and perhaps muddled is the transfer. Some people would argue that learning is a form of transfer. You know, you do the task once, and then you transfer what you learn to the next time, and you transfer what you learn to the time after that. So that would be sort of a within-person transfer, if you will. But a lot of when we were looking at transfer, we were looking at transfer across groups. So then we'd look at how experience by one group affected a focal group. But I think it depends on what are doing the transfer.
So this actually is a nice lead up to my follow-on question, because one way to think about learning, if we go sort of Sid's work with Dick Nelson, is to think about it could essentially be inappropriate or incorrect transfer, right? Or even incorrect learning. So I'm just curious from you, in the research that you've done, although I wouldn't necessarily frame it as you're a technology innovation person, certainly what you do speaks to this issue of innovation. I'm wondering, in all the work that you've done, how often do you come across this idea that as groups learn and maybe misapply insights that they've generated from others, that actually leads to new ways of organizing or new ways of solving a problem? I'm trying to get your take on what's the connection between learning and innovation.
So I think that maybe the most obvious is with experience. You do learn things that you can apply, and then if you think of innovation as recombination, the learning helps you get to things having things, if you will, to recombine. The whole issue of learning, while transfer, if we're studying transfer in the context of a student transferring, what they learn on one physics problem to another physics problem, which is amazingly hard for those of us who teach, and we realize, we do I did once, I had problem sets that I thought were so obvious it mapped onto test questions. It would almost be, everyone would get 100, and I found out, no, that even that kind of transfer is hard. But in organizations, you get many more factors coming in, and sometimes it does get recombined in ways that are very adaptive or functional or useful. So the transfer, even at the individual level, it often isn't as tight a replication as at least some of the instructional textbooks would have you believe. But at when you go to the transferring across groups or transferring across organizations, there's a lot more slippage that can come in, but can also lead to good things happening and new adaptations as you go along.
Good questions. Stefano.
Thank you very much. I was wondering whether going from the micro to the macro, you have any thoughts about the relationship between the field of organizational learning and the rise of big data? With the panels this morning, and we're emphasizing a lot of two things. One, this is going to affect the way we learn about things. And two, this is generating a gigantic amount of data that we can in principle use to make predictions about human behavior without either going to the lab or the field, in a way kind of on our computer screens. So I want just to know your thoughts on that.
Right, I think that's a fascinating area. On the positive side, people that study learning have often talked about the paucity of experience. Jim March has that great paper with Mihail Tahmuz and Lee Sproul, learning from samples of one or fewer, where we often don't get that much data. If you're doing an orbital launch, those happen rarely, and you only get a few, at least at the level of launching the space shuttle, only get a few instances. And how do you learn from them? So on the one hand, I think the availability of data can help us overcome some of those limits of experience. So on the one hand, I think it's very exciting, but on the other hand, everything we know about, how people learn, it's not, how do you make sense of the big data, and how do you draw the right inferences or the better inferences? I think there's a lot that we need to learn about that. You don't come to that data typically blank slate, and how you interpret that and what you learn from, I think will be fascinating. I'd be interested in it sounds like you've thought about this, so what would be interested in your insights or? you think it's a fruitful research area, or?
Well, I was with this panel and I was really listening to people who knew about that more than I do. And I think that Mary and Williams made a very nice point about the distinction between prediction and explanation. And I think the point was that big data are very good for predicting behavior, but they're not necessarily good at explaining that way.
The why.
And for that, maybe you need more kind of traditional methodologies and engage in the field and go out there. I think that was a point which was very, very useful to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a nice distinction. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes. I am, our sound man just said, use the mic. So I'm going to ask you to use the mic.
Hi, hello. I wanted to ask you in the management science paper 2003, you distinguish between motivation, ability, and opportunity in learning. And it seems that the field is moving a little bit towards that direction to understand how these microprocesses interact. What is your take on that? First of all, how do you differentiate those three, and how do they interact? Thank you.
Wow, that sounds like many papers right there. Those are great questions. I think we got into that in part realizing that when you get to the why, when you try to explain why something happens, does a social network have this effect because of the opportunity to more information, opportunity, access to data? Is it more motivating because you know who's what in or the members, so you're going to be more motivated to do things in their interests? So I think it's very important. I haven't done the sort of research you're talking about. Maybe you have, and you can share it with us in terms of some of the challenges and how you've solved them.
Oh, yeah, it's not, I think it's still not solved in a way. We could actually define opportunities in various ways. And opportunities could be, as you talk about, the amount of information that is available, or the social networks, the type of networks that actually exist, but also can be strategic opportunities when we talk about cross-organization transfer. But I think what's interesting now is sort of how do they interact in order to increase the amount of learning and the amount of transfer between organizations. But I'd be very happy to talk about it.
Yeah, it sounds like you're doing great work on.
The next question's right behind you.
I was interested in your comment about identity and the relationship between identity and learning, and situations in which identities lead to learning and not learning. And I just wondered if you could elaborate perhaps on some of the range of identities that you think are more likely to lead to learning than not, and perhaps talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that you see at work in that process.
So I can talk in two specific ways, and then I'm eager to hear what you all are doing on it. So one way is coming more out of the social psych literature in terms of whether people share an identity or feel that they're part of the same group. So that is the way that Amy Kane and John Levine and I used the identity when we did that initial study. So if you felt like you're part of the same group, would you be more willing to share information? That doesn't mean that you would blindly adopt. So if we're in the same group, I'm not going to go along with anything he says, but I'll give him a chance. I'll want to learn from him. I'll listen to him. So we saw it as a more of a cognitive, giving someone well, maybe I shouldn't use that term, but giving someone a chance to say what they had to say and listening to that and processing it. I'll come back to the mindful processing. But so that was one mechanism. I'm doing the other approach to identity is more sort of content, where you have an identity as a particular type of organization or a particular type of person. And I'm working with a student. This is a departure from me, but one of our students, Courtney Williamson, persuaded me that this was a really important context, which is community colleges. So you know how once you find a new organization, you find out all these interesting things about it you didn't know before. And evidently at any point in time, about half of the people in college are in community colleges, yet their graduation rate is really problematic. You know, it takes many, many years instead of the 2, and still most don't graduate. So we've been looking at, well, how one might approach this. So this is more individual learning. So this is, Connie, I'm not saying that we need to study individual learning, but for this purpose. And we've gotten interested in just the idea of an identity as a student. Do you see yourself as a student? And then that might make it more likely that you would, that you'd study, that you would, you know, turn down some social opportunity to study, that you would persist, et cetera. So in that sense, we're looking, very different arena, but we're looking more at the content of identity. But I see some people in the organizational field also looking more at content of identity. But then it's often sort of idiographic to what the, you know, particular kind of organizations you're studying are. It sounds like you've done some work on this. Are you?
We're actually just getting into it right now because we've been doing some work at more of a macro, meso kind of level with organizations and society. And we've been challenged to think about, well, how does what's happening at the individual level play into this? And so we're looking for that linkage right now. And identity is one way we've been going, looking primarily at the role of R&D engineers as scientists.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
So we're at very early stages, hence the question.
So you might take a look, if you haven't seen it, Ann Miner and one of her students, who's now in Florida, and I'm not remembering his name, but they were looking at the difference between, and I think the context was R&D, who saw themselves more as scientists. But if you send me an email, I could probably connect you with the person who's doing the, well, I'm sure I could connect you, and I think it's relevant, but truthfully, it was a while since I heard about it, so I'm not 100% sure.
So Gabriel has chosen to use his prerogative as IG chairperson and ask the very last question of the session.
Okay. Uh-oh, it's going to be a big...
Well, I think this session is about sort of getting to know the ideas and the people behind the ideas. And you mentioned, as we were going through your timeline, the many people you have met, and they've shaped the way and the questions you face and how you thought about them. One name I haven't heard, and I know he's been a very important person in your intellectual trajectory, is Herb Simon.
Right.
He's been a colleague for many years. In our private exchanges, you've mentioned many times your conversations with him. I wonder if you could share any story, any anecdote of organizational learning, Linda Argote and Herbert Simon.
Okay. Well, Herbert Simon is, of course, an amazing person. And as Gabriel said, I was fortunate enough to have him as a colleague at Carnegie Mellon for many years. And I think Sunkee and Florian did have him on my the timeline, but I haven't worked with him directly, so it didn't come up in the discussion. So when I got to Carnegie Mellon, I right away, or not right away, but fairly early wanted to, make a connection with Dr. Simon. So I called his phone, expecting to get a secretary, to make an appointment to see him. So I'm on the phone, and the old black one, remember? And he answers, and I said, well, Dr. Simon, I wanted to come talk to you. I'm just joined the faculty, and I'm really interested in what you're doing on coordination. And he says, well, come on over. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm not ready. I haven't written up my questions. So, but I did go over and had a wonderful conversation with him. As you may know, he started out his career in what was the graduate school of, I shouldn't say started out, because his time at Carnegie Mellon, he started out in the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, which morphed in around 2004 into the Tepper School of Business, where I am now. But around the 60s, mid-60s, he decided that he really wanted to study cognitive psychology. He wanted to get very micro. So he actually physically left the business school and went to the psych department. He was still on our policy committee, still had connections, but he was mainly in psychology and claimed to not be interested in organizations anymore. I didn't fully believe that, but, and then over time, I think he I remember when Lee Sproul and Michael Cohen did the the conference was in either 88 or 89 that some of the papers were published in the Org Science 91 special issue on organizational learning. There was a conference at Carnegie before that, and Herb came to that and was very engaged with organizational learning, and then seemed to get more engaged and started coming. We started a new seminar in 1990, Groups and Organizations, and he was our first speaker, and then he started coming to that. So he did get, I think he was interested all along, but he, seemed to get more engaged. But he was an amazing person, amazingly generous. He could be hard-hitting. I mean, if he didn't agree with, he didn't suffer fools gladly. But if he thought you were honest and, trying to understand what was going on, he would be very generous in the time he gave you, and was just an amazingly broad. I mean, he could do interdisciplinary work just by working with himself, because he, was so knowledgeable about so many fields.
Is there any other sort of pressing question, or that you'd like to? Okay, so I guess
the mic is mine. Before we let Linda go, I would, and before we thank Linda for the time that she spent with us today, I would also like to say thank you to Florian Sunkee. There was an enormous amount of work that went into this, only part of which is captured in the document that you've seen. But they did interviews with Linda on Skype. They met with her in Orlando at the Academy of Management. So please join me in thanking these two fine gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd also like to mention that all the Sunday sessions at SMS, this part of the Sunday sessions, are the responsibility of the Associate Program Chair, not me. I did no work on this session. I just showed up. It's Stefano Brissoni from ETH Zurich, so let's thank him. And finally, we can thank our guest of honor today, Miss Linda Argote. Thank you, gentlemen. And we are officially done.